Picture this. It is the year 862, and somewhere in the tangled wilderness of what is now northern Russia, a river is beginning to freeze. The ice comes quietly at first, a thin skin at the edges, barely visible in the grey morning light, forming along the reeds where the current moves slowest. Then, over the course of a few weeks, it thickens, it spreads, until one morning, the whole surface of the Volkhov River has gone silent, locked solid under a ceiling of white, and the world above it looks completely still. But it is not still. Not at all. Because somewhere upstream, hauled up onto the frozen bank, their curved prows jutting into the cold air like the necks of great wooden beasts are longships. Dozens of them, perhaps more. And around those ships, warming their hands over fires built from pine branches, sharpening blades and eating dried fish, and speaking a language that sounds nothing like anything the local Slavic and Finnic tribes have ever heard before, are men, tall men. Men with braided beards and iron rings on their arms, and a particular kind of stillness behind their eyes that comes not from peace, but from long experience of violence and long experience of survival, which in the world they inhabit are more or less the same thing. These men are called by the peoples they encounter the Rus, or sometimes the Varangians. To the Arab traders they meet further south, they are the Arus, a strange and formidable people who appear from the north like a force of nature, trade hard, fight harder, and disappear again before anyone has fully figured out where they came from. To the Byzantine Greeks of Constantinople, they are simultaneously terrifying enemies, invaluable mercenaries, and fascinating subjects of diplomatic puzzlement. And to the world of modern scholarship, they are one of the great unresolved arguments of medieval history, because the question of who these people actually were and what they actually did and how much credit or blame they deserve for shaping the civilizations that rose and fell along these rivers has been argued over for centuries and shows no sign of being fully settled today. What we do know, what the archaeology and the chronicles and the linguistic evidence and the river sediment and the buried hoards of silver all agree upon, is that they came from Scandinavia. They were, in their origins, Norse. They were Vikings, or at least they were the same people, from the same culture, with the same ships, and the same gods, and the same restless, calculating hunger for trade and silver, and new horizons that sent other Norsemen west to Iceland and Greenland and the shores of North America. Only these particular Vikings went east and south. They went into a world of rivers, and what they found there, and what they built there, and what they became there. The Kievan Rus, the ancestors of modern Russia and Ukraine, the traders who silver-flooded Scandinavia, the warriors who twice sailed to attack the greatest city in the medieval world. That is the story we're going to tell tonight. It is a story about ships on frozen rivers and ships on open seas. It is a story about what happens when a seafaring culture runs out of sea and finds, to its surprise and delight, that rivers will do just as well. It is a story about trade and conquest and transformation. It is a story about how a group of Norse adventurers became, over the course of barely 2 centuries, the founders of states that would shape the next 1,000 years of European history. We are going to follow the rivers south from the Baltic to the Black Sea, from the Gulf of Finland to the gates of Constantinople. We are going to meet Rurik, the semi-legendary Norse chieftain who may or may not have been invited to rule Novgorod, and whose dynasty gave its name to half a millennium of Russian princes. We are going to sit in the markets of Constantinople and Bulgar and Baghdad, where Rus traders sold slaves and furs and honey and bought silk and silver and spices. We are going to follow the portage routes where men heave their longships out of the water and drag them overland for miles, carrying their ships like enormous, absurd, magnificent pieces of luggage between one river system and the next. We're going to watch as Norse warriors slowly, generation by generation, stopped being Vikings and started being Russians. And we're going to try to understand why that transformation matters, not just as history, but as a story about identity and about how cultures are made and unmade and remade again by the rivers they travel. Before we dive in, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this strange little corner of the internet, and thank you for being here. Now, let's go back to the rivers. To understand what the Varangians encountered when they began pushing east and south in the 8th and 9th centuries, you have to first understand the landscape. And the landscape of what is now Russia, Ukraine and Belarus is, to a degree that modern maps don't fully convey, defined almost entirely by water. Eastern Europe is a vast plain. There are no mountain ranges to speak of, no dramatic natural barriers, no features that would make a map maker reach for exciting vocabulary. What there is, instead, is an almost unbelievable density of rivers. The region is laced with them. Great rivers and small ones, fast rivers and slow ones, rivers that run northeast to southwest and rivers that run the other direction, rivers that are wide enough to sail a large vessel, and rivers narrow enough to wade. The Dnieper, the Volga, the Don, the Oka, the Western Dvina, the Neva, the Volkhov, each one a thread in an immense watery web that stretches from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south, to the Caspian Sea in the southeast. 3 seas connected by rivers, waiting for someone clever enough to use them. The climate of the region added another dimension to this geography. Winters in this part of the world are long and serious. Rivers freeze not just at their edges but completely. Solid enough to walk on, solid enough to drive loaded sledges on, solid enough in some cases to build temporary structures on. For the peoples who lived along these rivers, this annual freezing was simply part of the rhythm of life. Autumn meant putting away your boat and getting out your sledge. Spring meant the dramatic, sometimes violent thaw, the ice breaking up with cracks and groans that could be heard for miles, the river running high and brown and fast, carrying debris from hundreds of miles upstream. In this landscape, before the Norse arrived, lived a patchwork of peoples whose histories we know imperfectly, filtered through the accounts of outsiders and the evidence of what archaeologists have dug up. In the north, around the Great Lakes and the forested rivers that drained into the Baltic, lived Finnic peoples, the ancestors of modern Finns, Karelians and Estonians, and related groups like the Veps and the Meria and the Muroma, whose names appear in early chronicles and then slowly fade as they were absorbed into the surrounding cultures. These were largely hunter-gatherers and small-scale farmers, organised in loose kinship groups, trading furs and amber, fishing the lakes, keeping to themselves. Further south and east, the population was predominantly Slavic, part of the great Slavic expansion that had been spreading across Eastern Europe since roughly the 5th and 6th centuries, filling in the spaces left by the migration of various Germanic and steppe peoples. The Eastern Slavs were farmers and warriors, organised in tribal confederacies, speaking a range of closely related languages that were the ancestors of modern Russian, Ukrainian, Belarusian and Polish. They grew rye and millet in the dark, fertile soil of the river valleys. They kept bees. The rivers would make them extraordinarily important, as honey and wax were among the most valuable trade goods in the medieval world. They built wooden towns on high river banks, surrounded by earthen ramparts. They had their own gods, their own customs, their own systems of tribute and exchange. And to the south and southeast, beyond the great forest belt, lay the steppe, the vast grassland corridor that stretched from Hungary in the west all the way to Mongolia and China in the east, and which served as the highway for a succession of nomadic peoples who would profoundly affect the history of the region. In the 8th and 9th centuries, the dominant power on the western steppe was the Khazar Khaganate, a remarkable cosmopolitan empire centered on the lower Volga and the North Caucasus, whose ruling elite had converted to Judaism, but whose population included Muslims, Christians, pagans, and everything in between. The Khazars controlled the critical junction where the Volga met the Caspian Sea, which meant they controlled the overland and river trade between the north and the Islamic world. They were rich, sophisticated, and pragmatic. They would become one of the first and most important partners of the Rus traders pushing south. Further south still, beyond the Khazars, lay the Islamic Caliphate, by the 8th century no longer unified but still immensely wealthy and culturally sophisticated, its cities producing silk and silver and glass and philosophical texts, its merchants trading from the Atlantic coast to the Pacific, and at the western end of the Black Sea, accessible via the Dnieper and its tributaries, sat the one city that dominated the imagination of every trader, warrior, and diplomat in the medieval world. Constantinople, the new Rome, the queen of cities, the centre of the Byzantine Empire, which had inherited the institutions and the cultural prestige of Rome while adding the fervour of Orthodox Christianity, the sophistication of Greek philosophy, and the cold calculation of a civilization that had been managing barbarian neighbours for a very long time. These were the destinations that awaited anyone clever or brave or desperate enough to navigate the rivers of Eastern Europe from the Baltic to the Black Sea. And when the Norse traders and warriors began arriving in the late 8th century, they understood, with the immediate practical intelligence of people who'd been making long-distance voyages in small wooden boats for generations, that the river system in front of them was an opportunity of almost incomprehensible scale. Before we can understand how the Norse conquered the rivers of Eastern Europe, we have to understand the tool that made it possible. The Viking longship is one of the most remarkable objects that human beings have ever built, and it is worth spending some time with it, not just admiring it as a symbol, which is how it usually gets treated in popular history, but understanding it as a piece of engineering, as a solution to specific problems, as a technology that shaped an entire civilization. The longship was, at its core, a vessel designed to operate in two completely different environments, the open sea and inland waters. This sounds simple, but it represented a genuinely difficult engineering challenge, and the Norse solved it with a degree of elegance that was not matched by any other shipbuilding tradition in the medieval world. The secret was the clinker-built hull, a construction technique where the planks of the hull overlap each other like the scales of a fish, each plank riveted to the ones above and below it, creating a structure that was extraordinarily flexible. Where a heavy, rigid ship would break apart in rough seas, a clinker-built longship would flex, absorbing the energy of the waves rather than fighting it. This made the ship seaworthy in conditions that would have swamped or broken a less sophisticated vessel. But flexibility was only one of the longship's advantages. The other was its draft, the depth below the waterline. A longship, even a large one, drew only about a metre of water, sometimes less. This was not an accident. It was a deliberate design choice, and it opened up possibilities that were simply not available to any other sailing vessel of the era. A longship could be sailed up rivers. It could cross sandbars that would ground a heavier vessel. It could be paddled through the shallows when the wind died. And in extremis, in the situation the Eastern Vikings would face repeatedly, it could be hauled out of the water entirely and dragged overland, carried by a crew of strong men over the portage routes between one river system and the next. The longships used on the eastern routes were not always the great war vessels of popular imagination, the massive 60-oar beasts that feature in films and video games. The rivers required something more practical, and the Norse traders who work the eastern routes often used a type of vessel called a birding or a nar, broader, deeper, slower than a warship, but capable of carrying substantial cargo. The distinction between a trader and a warship was, in any case, somewhat artificial in the Viking world. Every ship was a fighting ship if the situation required it. The men who rowed them were always armed. The same vessel that carried bales of furs and barrels of honey one year might carry armed warriors the next, depending on the opportunities and the dangers of the route. The longship required a crew, and the crew requirement shaped the entire social structure of the Norse expansion. A large longship needed 40 or 50 oarsmen to function effectively. This meant that any venture, a trading voyage, a raiding expedition, a colonization effort, required the cooperation of a significant group of men. The basic unit of Norse expansion was not the individual adventurer, but the ship crew, bound together by ties of loyalty, shared profit, and shared danger. The leader of such a crew needed to be not just brave but persuasive, able to convince enough men to follow him, able to manage the competing ambitions and grievances of a group of armed, capable, independent-minded warriors over a voyage that might last months or years. This social structure, the ship crew as the basic unit, the chieftain as the first among near equals, would have profound consequences for what the Norse built in the East. They were not conquerors in the Roman sense, arriving with an organised army under a centralised command. They were confederations of ship crews, each pursuing their own interests, cooperating when it suited them, and fragmenting when it didn't. The political structures they built reflected this: loose, contested, personal, always dependent on the charisma and competence of the individual at the top. The ship itself carried a kind of mythology. Norse culture was saturated with maritime imagery. The ship was not just a tool, but a symbol of power, status, and connection between worlds. When a great Norse warrior died, he was often buried in his ship, the vessel that had been his home and his weapon and his identity was now his coffin and his chariot into the afterlife. When scholars excavate Viking graves along the eastern rivers, they find the same ship burial traditions being practiced in the heart of Russia, hundreds of miles from the nearest open sea. The men who lay there had carried their culture with them, and their culture was built around the ship, and those ships, adapted, modified, used in ways their original builders probably never imagined, were about to be pointed east, toward the sunrise, toward rivers that no Norse trader had yet navigated, toward silver and silk and a world of staggering complexity and wealth. The Norse presence in the East did not begin with a single dramatic moment. It crept, it accumulated, it built up over decades from the late 8th century onward in the way that all significant historical transformations actually happen, not as events, but as processes, invisible to the people living through them until suddenly, one day, the world is different, and everyone has to scramble to explain when and how it changed. The first contact between the Norse world and the eastern rivers was almost certainly commercial. The Baltic Sea in the 8th century was already a busy trading environment. Norse merchants and warriors were mixing with Slavic and Finnic traders along the southern Baltic coast, at emporiums and market towns like Hedeby on the Danish-German border, and Birka in Sweden, and a site called Staraya Ladoga, Old Ladoga, at the southern end of Lake Ladoga, not far from where the Volkhov River begins its journey north toward the Gulf of Finland. Staraya Ladoga is in many ways the true beginning of the Eastern Viking story, and it deserves more attention than it usually receives. Founded around 750 CE, possibly earlier, it was a multi-ethnic settlement that brought together Norse, Slavic and Finnic elements from its very beginning. The archaeology of the site is extraordinary. You can stand on the bank of the Volkhov River and look at the strata of human occupation like the pages of a book, each layer telling a slightly different story. There are Norse-style metalworking tools, Norse combs carved from reindeer antler, Norse jewellery. There are Slavic pottery styles. There are Finnic burial customs. It was a place where different worlds met, traded, argued, and occasionally intermarried, and out of that mixing something new began to form. The hybrid culture that would eventually call itself the Rus. From Ladoga, the rivers opened up. The Volkhov led south to Lake Ilmen, at whose southern shore another great trading centre would rise Novgorod, the city whose name literally means new fortress or new town, and which would become one of the most important commercial cities of medieval Europe. From Novgorod, traders could continue south along smaller rivers and portage routes, eventually reaching the headwaters of the Dnieper, which flowed south through the rich agricultural plains of what is now Ukraine to empty into the Black Sea near the Crimean Peninsula. The Black Sea led to Constantinople. Alternatively, from the Ladoga region, traders could head southeast along the Svir River to Lake Onega, then make their way to the Volga, the great river, the longest in Europe, which flowed southeast through the heart of the continent before emptying into the Caspian Sea. The Caspian led to the Islamic world, to the cities of Persia and the trade routes that connected them to Central Asia, India, and China. This was the route by which Arab silver would flow north in staggering quantities, paid for with the furs and slaves and amber that the Rus carried south. The men who mapped these routes and made them viable were not, in the early period, official representatives of any Norse state or political entity. They were entrepreneurs, in the most fundamental sense of the word, people willing to take enormous risks in pursuit of significant rewards. The journey from the Gulf of Finland to Constantinople by river took months. It passed through territories controlled by various tribal groups, some friendly, some hostile. It involved stretches of white water, most notoriously the cataracts of the lower Dnieper, a series of rocky rapids near what is now the city of Zaporizhzhia in Ukraine, that could destroy a boat and kill a crew. It required constant negotiation with local rulers for the right of passage and protection. It demanded an extraordinary combination of seamanship, commercial acumen, physical toughness, and political intelligence. The Norse who undertook these journeys were not random adventurers. They were professionals in the business of long-distance trade, with all that implies about organisation, capital, and knowledge. A successful trading voyage to Constantinople required months of preparation. You needed ships in good repair. You needed a cargo worth carrying. Furs of the highest quality, beaver and sable especially, were the luxury goods most valued by Byzantine buyers. You needed dried food for a crew of 40 or 50 men for a journey of several months. You needed silver for bribes and tolls. You needed men capable of fighting if the situation required it, because the situation often required it. And you needed the organisational capacity to bring all of these elements together, which meant either significant personal wealth or a network of backers willing to invest in your venture. Some of the earliest Norse traders in the east were probably based out of Gotland, the large Swedish island in the Baltic that served as one of the great trading hubs of the Viking Age. Gotlandic merchants had connections throughout the Baltic world, and when the eastern river routes began to open up, they were well positioned to exploit them. The island of Gotland has produced more Viking Age silver hoards than any other location on Earth, hundreds of them, containing tens of thousands of Arabic silver coins called dirhams, all ultimately traceable to the Islamic world via the eastern river routes. The scale of this silver influx is astonishing. It represents a trade network of continental proportions, operating for over a century, moving wealth from the silver mines of the Abbasid Caliphate to the farms and halls of Scandinavia via the rivers of Russia. To fully understand what the Norse were doing in Eastern Europe, you have to spend some time with the rivers themselves, not as lines on a map, but as living things, each with its own character, its own dangers, its own seasonal rhythms that dictated when and how they could be used. The Volkhov River, where our story effectively begins, is not a dramatic river. It is broad and slow and brown, moving northward from Lake Ilmen to Lake Ladoga, through a landscape of birch and pine, its banks low and often marshy, its current gentle enough to row against without great difficulty. In summer, it was navigable by sizable vessels. In winter, it froze, but the frozen surface served as a road. It was, in short, exactly the kind of river that a practical, commercially minded people would love, reliable, workable, connected to things. Lake Ilmen, at the southern end of the Volkhov, was a different matter. It still is, a large, shallow, temperamental body of water, prone to sudden squalls that could whip its surface into waves dangerous to small craft. Norse sailors used to the North Sea probably found it manageable but not comfortable. The shores of the lake were home to Slavic settlements, and the greatest of these, Novgorod, would develop at the lake's northern outlet, where the Volkhov begins, in a position that made it the natural gateway between the Baltic world and the river systems to the south. From the Ilmen region, reaching the Dnieper required crossing a watershed, the elevated ground where the rivers flowing north toward the Baltic began, and the rivers flowing south toward the Black Sea ended. This was accomplished via a series of smaller rivers and portage routes that varied depending on the season and the water levels. The main route seems to have passed through the upper Dnieper region, passing near what is now the city of Smolensk, which was already an important Slavic settlement and would become a major waypoint on the Norse trading route. The Dnieper itself is a river of a completely different character from the Volkhov. It is large, one of the longest rivers in Europe, and it moves through a landscape that changes dramatically as it flows south. In the north, near Smolensk, it runs through forest, its banks wooded and dark. Further south, it enters the steppe, the great open grassland of Ukraine, where the sky seems enormous and the horizon stretches in every direction, and you feel the presence of the Asian continent beyond. In this middle section, the Dnieper is broad and navigable, and it was along this stretch that the Norse established the settlement that would become their greatest eastern city, Kyiv. Kyiv, or Kiev, in its older English transliteration, sits on high bluffs above the western bank of the Dnieper, in a position of remarkable natural defensibility and commercial advantage. It commanded the most important river ford in the region. It stood at the junction of the forest and the steppe, which meant it had access to the furs and timber of the north and the agricultural wealth of the south. And it was the last major stopping point before the most dangerous stretch of the entire river route, the cataracts, the Dnieper cataracts, a series of rocky, rapids and waterfalls in the river's lower course, near what is now Zaporizhzhia, were the great obstacle of the eastern trading route, and they appear in our historical sources with a vividness that makes clear how deeply they impressed everyone who encountered them. The Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII, writing in the mid-10th century in his remarkable work De Administrando Imperio, essentially a strategic handbook for his successors, full of hard-won intelligence about the peoples on the empire's borders, described the cataracts in extraordinary detail, including their names in both Slavic and Norse, which provides us with some of our best linguistic evidence for the Norse identity of the Rus. Constantine listed 7 major cataracts by name. The Rus names he recorded are recognizably Old Norse: Esupi, do not sleep; Ulvorsi, island force; Gelandri, laughing rapid; Eifor, ever fierce; Varufor, wave force; Lianti, boiling water; Strukun, little, rapid. These names are not translations or approximations. They are Norse words preserved in a Greek text applied to rapids in the heart of what is now Ukraine, in a document written by a Byzantine emperor who had no particular reason to lie about what his informants told him. The cataracts have since been submerged by the Soviet-era Dnieper Dam, but their names survive, a small stubborn piece of Norse language preserved in a Greek text about a river in Ukraine. History is full of these strange survivals. At the cataracts, the Rus had to abandon any thought of sailing. They pulled their boats up onto the bank, unloaded everything, and either carried the cargo overland around the rapids or, for the smaller boats, dragged the entire vessel across the rocks, an exhausting, dangerous process that left them vulnerable to attack from the Pecheneg nomads of the steppe, who understood perfectly well that a group of men heaving a loaded boat over rocks was a group of men who couldn't fight back effectively. Constantine described the elaborate defensive measures the Rus took at the cataracts, posting armed guards on the surrounding heights, keeping weapons close at hand, moving quickly. The cataracts were a bottleneck, a place where wealth and vulnerability converged, and everyone in the region knew it. Past the cataracts, the lower Dnieper opened into a wide, slow, silty delta before meeting the Black Sea, or the Pontus Euxinus, as the Greeks still called it, the hospitable sea, a name that dripped with a careful irony of people who had learned to respect its sudden storms and treacherous shallows. From the Dnieper mouth, it was a straightforward if nerve-wracking coastal sail along the northern shore of the Black Sea, past the Crimean Peninsula where Byzantine trading colonies still maintained a precarious existence, and then through the Bosphorus Strait to Constantinople itself. The Volga route was longer, stranger, and in some ways even more extraordinary. From the Ladoga region, traders heading for the Volga route would travel east along the Svir River to Lake Onega, then south along the Vitigra, and through a complex of smaller waterways to the upper Volga. The Volga then carried them southeast, through a landscape that gradually transformed from dense boreal forest to mixed woodland to open steppe, the river growing larger and more impressive with each passing mile as it absorbed tributaries from both sides. Approximately halfway along the Volga route, at the confluence with the Kama River, lay the great trading city of Bulgar, not to be confused with Bulgaria on the Black Sea, but the Volga Bulgars, a Turkic people who had settled in the middle Volga region and established a prosperous mercantile state. Bulgar was a crossroads in the most literal sense, a place where traders from the north, south, east, and west converged, where furs from Siberia met silk from China, where Norse traders sat down to bargain with Arab merchants who had travelled thousands of miles from Baghdad or Samarkand. The city was large, sophisticated, and genuinely cosmopolitan. Arab travellers who visited it in the early 10th century, most famously the diplomat and writer Ibn Fadlan, whose account we will return to in detail, were struck by both its wealth and its strangeness. From Bulgar, the Volga continued southeast through the territories of the Khazar Khaganate to its delta on the Caspian Sea, where the Khazar capital of Itil controlled the crucial junction between the river world of the north and the sea routes to Persia and beyond. The Caspian was not the warm, blue Mediterranean of Byzantine imagination. It was a large, brackish inland sea, prone to storms, its eastern shore a desert, its southern shore backed by the mountains of the Caucasus and Persia. But across those southern shores lay the great cities of the Islamic world, and across those distances flowed the silver that made the whole enterprise worth the effort. There is one aspect of the Eastern Viking story that, when you stop to think about it carefully, is almost absurdly impressive, and it is the aspect that gets the least attention in popular accounts. It is the portage, the practice of pulling boats out of the water and carrying or dragging them overland from one river system to another. Consider what this actually involved. A typical trading vessel used on the eastern routes might be 8 to 12 metres long and weigh, fully laden, several tons. To portage this vessel, the crew had to first unload all the cargo. Then they had to get the boat out of the water, either by beaching it on a sloped bank and sliding it up, or by constructing some kind of wooden cradle or rollers. Then they had to move it over land, across terrain that might be forested, boggy, hilly, or any combination of the above, for distances that could range from a few hundred meters to several kilometers. Then they had to relaunch it in the new river, reload all the cargo, and continue on their way. This was not an occasional emergency measure. This was a routine part of every journey along the eastern river routes. The watershed between the northern and southern river systems was not a single crossing but a complex of watersheds, each requiring its own portage. Some of these crossings had been used so many times over so many centuries that permanent portage roads had developed, cleared paths through the forest, smoothed with gravel or lined with wooden rollers, maintained by local communities who charged tolls for their use. The portage points became economic nodes in their own right, places where traders had to stop, pay fees, rest their crews, and sometimes trade with the locals while waiting for good conditions. The physical demands of portage are hard to overstate. Moving a loaded boat overland was brutal work, requiring the coordinated effort of the entire crew, sustained over hours or days in conditions that might include heat, mud, insects, and the persistent anxiety of being slowed and vulnerable in unfamiliar territory. Norse sagas occasionally mention portage as a matter of course, with the same matter-of-fact tone used to describe cooking a meal or sharpening a sword. This was simply something you did, part of the job, not worthy of special comment. The design of the longship was, as we have noted, partly shaped by the requirements of portage. The shallow draft and the light, flexible hull were not just about navigating shallow rivers, they were about making the boats light enough to move overland. A vessel that needed to be carried as well as sailed had to be built differently from one that would spend its entire life at sea. The Norse understood this intuitively, and they built accordingly. There is also a less obvious aspect of the portage system that deserves attention: its role in creating political geography. The portage points were choke points, and choke points are power. Whoever controlled the portage between the Volkhov and the Dnieper watersheds controlled the most profitable trade route in northern Europe. This is one of the reasons why Smolensk, located near the critical upper Dnieper portage, became a major Rus town, and why every major Norse chieftain who established himself in the east made controlling the key portages a first priority. The portage was not just a logistical challenge, it was a strategic asset. Place names along the eastern route still preserve the memory of the portage system. The Russian word Volok, meaning portage, appears in dozens of place names along the old trade routes. Voloklamsky, Volok on the Lema River, Vishny Voloshyok, Upper Portage, still the name of a town in Tver Oblast that sits on an ancient portage between the Volga and the rivers flowing to the Baltic. These names are not just geographical labels, they are historical markers, preserving in the landscape the memory of the routes that once moved. The wealth of 3 continents from sea to sea. The Norse who used these portage routes did not, of course, invent them. Slavic and Finnic traders had been using the watershed crossings for centuries before the first Viking longship appeared on the Volkhov. What the Norse brought was the organisational capacity to use the routes at scale, the fighting capability to defend their cargoes along the way, and the commercial connections to the Byzantine world, to the Islamic world, to Scandinavia. That made moving goods along the route so spectacularly profitable. Every great civilization needs a founding story, and the Rus are no exception. The primary chronicle, the great medieval compilation of early Russian history, written by monks at the Kyiv-Pechursk monastery in the 11th and 12th centuries, provides one of the most famous and most contested founding narratives in European history. It tells the story of how the Slavic and Finnic tribes of the north, exhausted by internal warfare and unable to govern themselves, sent a delegation to the Varangians across the sea and invited them to come and rule. The famous passage reads, in one common translation, "Our land is great and rich, but there is no order in it. Come to rule and reign over us." Three brothers came in response to this invitation: Rurik, Cineas, and Truva. Rurik settled at Novgorod, Cineas at Beluzero, Truva at Izborsk. When his brothers died, Rurik consolidated his rule over the north, and after his death, his successor Oleg, either a kinsman or a regent for, Rurik's young son Igor, led an army south along the Dnieper, took Kyiv, and declared it the mother of Rus cities. From this dynasty, the Rurikids, all subsequent rulers of the Rus would claim descent for the next 700 years. This is a founding legend, and founding legends are, by their nature, complicated documents. They are partly history, partly mythology, partly political argument. The invitation of the Varangians story has been debated by historians since at least the 18th century, when it became entangled in the intensely politicized argument about whether the state of Rus, and by extension the Russian state, was created by indigenous Slavic initiative or by Scandinavian conquerors. This argument, known in scholarly literature as the Normanist controversy, still occasionally flares up, though most modern historians regard it as something of a false dichotomy. The Rus state, like most early medieval states, was the product of a complex interaction between multiple groups, and attributing its creation to any single ethnic group is more an act of nationalism than of history. What we can say with reasonable confidence is that a Norse chieftain named Rurik, or something very like that name, it corresponds to the Scandinavian name Hrurik, did establish himself in the Novgorod region in the second half of the 9th century, probably around 860 or shortly before. The name itself is Norse. The dynasty he founded bore Norse names for its first several generations: Igor, Norse Ingvar; Oleg, Norse Helgi; Olga, Norse Helga; Sviatoslav, a Slavic name representing the first generation of Slavic cultural assimilation, before gradually shifting to predominantly Slavic names as the dynasty became fully integrated into Slavic culture. Rurik's historical reality is harder to pin down than his legendary status. He appears in the Chronicle and almost nowhere else. There have been scholarly attempts to identify him with a historical figure known from Western European sources, a Danish chieftain named Rurik of Dorestad, who was active in the Frisian coast region of the Netherlands in the mid-9th century, and who disappears from those records at approximately the time Rurik appears in the east. The identification is tempting but unproven. It is the kind of historical coincidence that makes scholars cautious, suggestive enough to be worth noting, uncertain enough to be worth not leaning on. What is more important than the specific biography of Rurik is what his story represents. The moment when the Norse presence in the east shifted from a network of independent traders and raiders to something more organized and more durable. The establishment of a Norse ruling family at Novgorod was the beginning of the political structure that would eventually produce the state of Kievan Rus, not because one man founded a state by royal decree, but because a dynasty provided a framework around which the mixed, Norse-Slavic Finnic population of the region could organize, negotiate, trade, and occasionally fight. The early Rurikid rulers were, by the standards of the time, not so much kings as chief entrepreneurs. Their primary business was trade, specifically the organization of the annual trading expedition to Constantinople, known in the sources as the Polyudi, the round of tribute collection and commercial exchange that was the economic heartbeat of the Rus state. Every year, in the autumn, the Rus prince and his armed retinue, his druzhina, his war band, would travel through the territories under his control, collecting tribute in the form of furs, honey, wax, and slaves. They wintered over the boats, and in the spring, when the ice broke, the entire accumulated tribute would be loaded onto the boats, and the great convoy would set off south along the Dnieper toward Constantinople. This was the rhythm of the Rus economy, and it was a rhythm set by the rivers. The rivers froze, and you collected tribute. The rivers thawed, and you sailed to sell what you had collected. Everything depended on the water, on its seasonal behaviour, on its navigability, on who controlled it, and at what price. The Rus prince who could guarantee his traders safe passage along the river route to Byzantium was worth paying tribute to. The one who couldn't was just another warlord with a group of armed followers and no particular claim on anyone's loyalty. Oleg, the man who took Kyiv and made it the centre of the Rus realm, is in some ways a more vivid historical figure than Rurik, if only because more stories have been told about him. The chronicle calls him the prophet, Oleg Veshchi, because of his reputation for wisdom and foresight. He is credited with the famous exchange in which a wizard predicts that he will be killed by his favourite horse. Oleg laughs at this, sends the horse away, and believes himself safe. Years later, hearing that the horse has died, he goes to look at the bones and is bitten by a snake that has been living in the skull. He dies of the bite. It is a story that appears in Norse sagas, in Russian chronicles, and in Ukrainian folklore, and it has the feeling of a myth that has attached itself to a real person over time, accumulating resonance. What Oleg certainly did, or what someone ruling in Novgorod and Kyiv in the late 9th and early 10th century certainly did, was to establish the basic political and economic structure of the Kievan Rus. A Norse ruling dynasty over a predominantly Slavic population, extracting tribute and selling it to Byzantium, controlling the river routes, and projecting enough military power to maintain their position against the various threats. Nomadic peoples of the steppe, rival Norse chieftains, rebellious Slavic tribes, that pressed on them from every direction. Constantinople in the 10th century was, without question, the most impressive city in the world that a Rus trader was likely to encounter. It was not the largest city in the world. That honour probably belonged to the great Chinese capital, or possibly Baghdad at its peak. But for a Norse warrior who had grown up in the timber and longhouse world of Scandinavia, or even a Slavic trader from the wooden towns of the Dnieper Valley, Constantinople was something that defied easy comprehension. It was another order of civilization entirely. The city occupied a triangular peninsula at the junction of the Bosphorus Strait and the Sea of Marmara, ringed by massive walls on its landward side, walls that would not be breached for 1,000 years, and defended on its seaward sides by the waters themselves and by the Byzantine navy. Within those walls lived somewhere between 300,000 and 500,000 people, making it by far the largest city in Christendom. It had running water delivered by aqueducts, sewers, public baths, hospitals, a hippodrome capable of holding 100,000 spectators, palaces of almost incomprehensible luxury, and churches, most of all the Hagia Sophia, whose scale and beauty struck visitors dumb. The Rus traders who arrived at Constantinople each spring were not allowed into the city freely. Byzantine diplomacy with the Rus was careful and precisely calibrated, as befitted an empire that had a lot of experience managing potentially dangerous barbarian visitors. The treaties that the Rus concluded with Byzantium, and we have texts of several of them, preserved in the primary chronicle from 907, 911, 944, and 971, specified exactly how many Rus traders could enter the city at one time, where they were to be housed in a specific suburb not within the main walls, what they were to be provided with, and what goods they were permitted to trade. The Rus, in turn, agreed not to pillage the suburbs, to conduct their business within the specified time frame, and to return north at the end of the trading season. The trading was enormously profitable for both sides. The Rus brought the goods of the north, furs of outstanding quality, the sable and beaver and mink that Byzantine aristocrats wore as status symbols, that were sewn into the robes of the imperial court, that ended up in churches all over the Christian world as vestments and furnishings. They brought wax, which Byzantium consumed in industrial quantities for candles. The Orthodox Church burned candles in numbers that are almost impossible to imagine, in hundreds of churches at every service around every holy image, and all that wax came ultimately from the beekeepers of the Slavic north. They brought honey, which was not just a sweetener but also the raw material for mead, the primary alcoholic beverage of northern Europe, and they brought slaves. The slave trade is an uncomfortable part of the Rus story, and it deserves direct acknowledgement rather than euphemism. The Rus were major slave traders, and the human beings they sold were, primarily the Slavic and Finnic populations of Eastern Europe, people captured in raids, people sold by their own tribal leaders in payment of tribute, people who had been enslaved in the various small wars that characterized life along the river routes. The Byzantine market for slaves was substantial, and so was the Islamic market further east. The word slave itself is derived from Slav, a linguistic fact that speaks to the scale and the notoriety of this trade in the medieval world. The Rus did not invent slavery in Eastern Europe, but they organized and expanded it on a commercial scale that was genuinely new. In exchange for their northern goods, the Rus received what Byzantium had and the north desperately wanted: silk. Byzantine silk was the most prestigious textile in the medieval world, produced in state-controlled workshops using techniques that Byzantium guarded jealously, dyed in colours that could not be replicated elsewhere, embroidered with gold thread in patterns of extraordinary complexity. Silk was not just a luxury, it was a form of currency and a marker of status, used to reward allies, bribe enemies, dress the clergy, and display the power of the imperial court. The Rus absorbed enormous quantities of it, carrying it north to their own aristocratic market and onward to Scandinavia. They also received silver, wine, glassware, bronze objects, and, perhaps most significantly for the long term, religious art and architecture. Constantinople was the capital of Orthodox Christianity and the greatest centre of artistic production in the Christian world. The icons, the mosaics, the illuminated manuscripts, the church plate that Byzantine craftsmen produced set the aesthetic standard for Orthodox art for centuries. When the Rus eventually converted to Christianity, they turned to Constantinople for everything: for missionaries, for theologians, for bishops, for artists, for architects, for the very concept of what a Christian civilization should look like. The commercial relationship preceded and enabled the religious and cultural relationship in ways that are easy to overlook. The Byzantine court was not simply passive in its dealings with the Rus. Byzantine diplomacy was sophisticated and active, and the Byzantines worked hard to manage the Rus, to channel their energy into commercial rather than military directions, to create a network of obligations and interests that made warfare less attractive than trade. One of the most effective tools of Byzantine diplomacy was religion, and the efforts to convert the Rus to Christianity began much earlier than the famous baptism of Vladimir in 988. Individual Rus traders and warriors were converting in Constantinople throughout the 10th century, taking home not just silk and silver, but a new understanding of the world. The Empress Olga, grandmother of Vladimir the Baptizer, regent of Kyiv in the mid-10th century after the death of her husband Igor, was herself baptized in Constantinople, possibly as early as 957, in a ceremony that the Byzantine court treated as a major diplomatic event. The primary chronicle preserves a story about her visit to Constantinople that may be partly legendary, but has the ring of genuine cultural observation. She impressed the emperor so much with her intelligence and dignity that he proposed marriage, and she deflected the proposal by pointing out that she was his godmother, and therefore the marriage would be incestuous, a clever use of her new Christian identity to protect her political independence. Whether the story is literally true or not, it captures something real about the relationship between the Rus and Byzantium, a relationship of mutual calculation mutual respect and mutual fascination, conducted between people who are very different in their cultures and equally certain that the other party needed them more than they needed the other party. Not all the Rus' visits to Constantinople were commercial. 3 times in the 9th and 10th centuries, Rus fleets appeared in the Bosphorus not with trade goods, but with weapons, and the story of these raids, their scale, their audacity, their outcomes, and their long aftermath, is one of the most dramatic sequences in the entire history of the medieval world. The first great raid came in 860, and it was shocking in its speed and its apparent success. A fleet of approximately 200 longships. The chronicles give various numbers, all of them probably approximate, appeared suddenly in the waters outside Constantinople. The Emperor Michael III was away from the city at the time, dealing with a military crisis on the eastern frontier, and his absence added to the alarm. The Rus raiders burned and plundered the suburban settlements outside the city walls, the wealthy estates and monasteries that ringed Constantinople on its landward approaches. The city itself, with its massive walls and its large professional garrison, was a different matter, and the Rus do not seem to have attempted to assault the walls directly. Instead, they ravaged everything they could reach outside, terrorizing the population, carrying off slaves and valuables, and then disappearing back north before the imperial forces could return to deal with them. The raid of 860 had a lasting impact on Byzantine consciousness. The Patriarch Photios, one of the most brilliant men of the 9th century, described it in a homily that gives us some of our most vivid descriptions of the attack: the terror of the citizens, the fires visible from the walls, the sight of the Rus fleet on the water. He also, characteristically, drew a religious lesson from the event. The raid was a punishment for Christian sins, and the people's prayers and the intercession of the Virgin Mary's robe, carried in procession around the city walls, had driven the attackers away. This is the kind of interpretation we would expect from a 9th century bishop, and it need not detain us. But the underlying anxiety it reflects, the sudden realization that a new and dangerous power had appeared from the north, was entirely real. The second great Rus attack on Constantinople came in 907, under the leadership of Oleg, the ruler of Kyiv. The sources describe an enormous fleet. The primary chronicle claims 2,000 ships, which is certainly an exaggeration, but the scale was evidently impressive enough to alarm the Byzantines seriously. Oleg's force reportedly pulled their boats up onto the shore and fitted them with wheels to roll them overland, bypassing the chain that the Byzantines had stretched across the Golden Horn to block naval access to the harbour. Whether this specific manoeuvre actually happened as described, or whether it is a legendary elaboration of a simpler logistical operation, is uncertain, but it has become one of the iconic images of Rus military ingenuity. The story goes on to say that Oleg hung his shield on the gates of Constantinople as a sign of victory before accepting a generous treaty and departing. The treaty that followed this campaign, the Treaty of 911, whose text is preserved in the primary chronicle, is one of the most remarkable documents of early medieval diplomacy. It is written in Greek and Old Slavic, with Norse names appearing for the Rus negotiators and witnesses. It specifies the trading rights of the Rus in Constantinople, the procedures for handling disputes between Rus and Greek merchants, the treatment of shipwrecked sailors, and the status of Rus mercenaries serving in the Byzantine army. It is a document between equals, or at least between parties who are treating each other as equals, and it reveals the complex, pragmatic relationship that had developed between the Norse-Slavic state of the Rus and the Greek Empire to its south. The third great assault came in 941, under Igor, son of Rurik and successor to Oleg. This campaign went dramatically. Differently from its predecessors, Igor brought a massive fleet south. Again, the chronicle's numbers are almost certainly exaggerated, but the Byzantine sources, which have no reason to inflate Rus numbers, also describe a very large force, and began raiding along the Bithynian coast of Asia Minor, the European shore of the Bosphorus, and the islands in the Sea of Marmara. The raiders' behaviour was described in Byzantine sources with a horror that suggests genuine atrocities: churches burned, priests killed, prisoners tortured and executed with studied cruelty. Whatever their commercial relationship with Byzantium in peacetime, the Rus warriors in a raid-in mode were not interested in diplomatic niceties. Then came Greek fire. The Byzantine navy deployed its most feared weapon against the Rus fleet, a mixture whose exact composition remains debated by historians and chemists, that burned on water and could not be extinguished by dousing. The ships carrying Greek fire had tubes mounted in their prows, and when they moved among the Rus vessels, they turned them into floating bonfires. The Rus, who had never encountered anything like this, were terrified. The chronicle's description, which may be a memory preserved through oral tradition before being written down, captures the shock of the experience. The Rus survivors said that the Greeks had lightning from the sky that set their ships and even the sea itself on fire. Many Rus warriors drowned trying to escape by jumping into the water while wearing armour. Igor's fleet limped home to Kyiv. He mounted a second expedition 3 years later, in 944. But by then Byzantine diplomacy had moved faster than his preparations. Byzantine envoys met the Rus fleet on the Danube with gifts and a proposal for a new treaty, and Igor, calculating the odds, accepted. The Treaty of 944 was somewhat less favourable to the Rus than the 911 agreement had been, reflecting the changed balance of power after the Greek fire disaster, but it still guaranteed significant trading rights and established a framework for the commercial relationship that would persist for another generation. These raids, their audacity, their partial successes, their dramatic failures, established the Rus in Byzantine consciousness as a force to be respected, managed, and if possible co-opted. The Byzantines were very good at co-opting dangerous neighbours. What they could not beat on the battlefield, they would recruit into their service, marry into their aristocracy, and eventually convert to their religion. All three of these strategies were deployed on the Rus, with results that would transform the history of Eastern Europe. While the Dnieper route to Constantinople dominated the political imagination of the Rus princes, it was the Volga route to the Islamic world that generated, for much of the 9th and early 10th centuries, the greatest volume of actual wealth. And the heart of that wealth was silver, specifically Arabic silver coins called dirhams, minted in their millions by the Abbasid Caliphate and its successor states, and flowing north through the river systems of Eastern Europe in quantities that still astonish archaeologists when they dig up the hoards where they were buried 1,000 years ago. The scale of this silver flow is genuinely remarkable. Over 10,000 Arabic silver coin hoards have been found in Scandinavia, Eastern Europe, and the Baltic region. The total number of coins involved runs into the hundreds of thousands, possibly more. The silver moved north in exchange for furs, the luxury furs of the boreal forest, which were prized throughout the Islamic world as status, goods and winter wear, and slaves. The demand in both directions was essentially unlimited within the constraints of the supply, and the Rus positioned themselves as the indispensable middlemen in a trade network that connected the Arctic forests of Siberia to the date palms of Iraq. Our most vivid and detailed account of this trade comes from a single extraordinary document, the Risala of Ahmad ibn Fadlan, written around 921 CE. Ibn Fadlan was a diplomat and writer sent by the Abbasid Caliph on a mission to the Volga Bulgars, who had requested guidance and religious instruction as they considered conversion to Islam. On his journey, which took him from Baghdad across the Central Asian steppe to the Middle Volga, he encountered a group of Rus traders at the Volga-Bulgar trading town, and he wrote about them with a combination of fascination, disgust, and careful observation that is without parallel in medieval literature. Ibn Fadlan's description of the Rus is famous and worth dwelling on. He described them as physically imposing, tall, with red hair, pale skin, tattooed from their fingernails to their necks with figures of trees and animals. He described their hygiene habits with poorly concealed horror, noting that they washed their faces in a shared basin of water that was passed from person to person, each man blowing his nose and spitting into it before handing it along, a practice that was simply normal in a culture where water was not always plentiful and communal. Bathing was a given, but that struck a Muslim observer from a culture with strict rules about ritual cleanliness as deeply unpleasant. He described their practice of carrying multiple swords and axes, their heavy drinking of fermented drinks described as similar to beer, and their commercial behaviour, which he depicted as sharp, energetic, and focused on silver above all else. The Rus merchants Ibn Fadlan observed were carrying their goods to sell, but they were also performing elaborate religious rituals at wooden idols they had set up in the marketplace, offering gifts, praying for good trading, negotiating with their gods as practically as they negotiated with their customers. But the most famous passage in Ibn Fadlan's account, and one of the most extraordinary pieces of writing from the entire medieval world, is his description of a Rus ship burial. He witnessed the funeral of a chieftain of high status, and he described it with the meticulous detail of a man who was simultaneously revolted and compelled. The dead man was laid out for 10 days while preparations were made. His ships were pulled up onto the shore. A young woman from among his slave girls had agreed, or been prevailed upon, to die with him. She was treated for the 10-day period as an honoured guest, given drink, dressed in fine clothes, and visited by the men of the crew in a ritual of a sexual nature that Ibn Fadlan described with careful circumspection. On the day of the funeral, the chieftain's body was placed in a grave goods-laden tent erected in his ship. An old woman, called the Angel of Death, directed the proceedings. The slave girl was given drink until she was in a state of semi-consciousness, then was walked 3 times round the ship while various ritual acts were performed. She was then lifted over the gunwale of the ship and laid with the dead chieftain. Several of the men of the crew, averting their faces, completed the sacrifice with a knife and a cord. Then the ship was set alight, and Ibn Fadlan watched it burn until only ash remained. A man standing near him during the ceremony, hearing that Ibn Fadlan was shocked by the burning, explained it to him through an interpreter. "You Arabs are stupid. You take the people you love most and the things you value most and you put them in the ground, where the worms eat them. We burn them in an instant and they go straight to paradise." It is one of those moments where the past speaks to you, across 1,000 years, with almost painful directness. Ibn Fadlan's account has been verified partially and indirectly by archaeology. Scandinavian-style ship burials have been found along the Volga and in the Upper Volga region, some of them containing the physical evidence of exactly the kind of ceremony he described. Burned remains, grave goods, traces of the ritual process. The details match well enough that scholars treat his account as broadly reliable, despite the inevitable distortions of observation across cultural distance. The silver from the Islamic trade was not just wealth, it was politically transformative. In a world without coinage of its own, Scandinavia was flooded with silver from the east, and that silver enabled the consolidation of political power, the funding of military campaigns, the construction of trading networks and fortifications. The great Norse expansion of the Viking Age, west to Britain, Ireland, France and America, south to the Mediterranean, east to Russia, was powered to a significant degree by the silver that came up the Volga in exchange for furs and slaves. The eastern river routes were not just a regional story, they were one of the engines of the Viking Age as a whole. It is easy, when writing about trade routes and political structures and military campaigns, to lose sight of the human texture of daily life, the ordinary moments that made up most of an individual's experience of the Eastern River world. Let us slow down for a moment and try to see what it was actually like to be a rust trader in the 10th century, moving along these rivers between worlds. You would wake before dawn in a camp on a riverbank, with dew on your sleeping roll and the smell of smoke from last night's fire already gone cold. Your ship is pulled up on the bank behind you, its curved prow just visible in the grey light. Around you, the other men in your party are stirring, 20-30 of you, a mix of Norse-speaking traders and Slavic crew members who handle the oars and know the local river conditions. Someone is already breaking out the dried fish and hardtack that make up most of your provisions on the river. Someone else is checking the ropes and fittings on the boats. The journey you're on has been months in the planning and will take months to complete. You left Novgorod in the early spring, as soon as the ice broke on the Volkhov. To leave earlier would mean sailing through floating ice floes that could damage the hull. To leave later would mean arriving in Constantinople after the Byzantine court had closed the trading period and sent the merchants home. The timing of the river journey was dictated by the timing of the seasons, and the timing of the seasons was dictated by forces no one controlled. In your cargo hold, wrapped in oiled cloth against the river damp, are the goods that will pay for your journey: bales of furs, beaver, otter, mink, and 3 bundles of sable worth more than the rest combined, acquired at enormous expense from a Bulgar middleman who had got them from even further north and east. There are barrels of honey and wax. There are slaves, 5 of them, Slavic captives acquired in a border raid authorized by the Prince of Kyiv, who takes his cut of everything. The slaves are thin, frightened, and quiet. You try not to think about them too much. The day begins with loading the boats and setting off. On a good stretch of river, you make 15 to 20 miles a day. More if the current is with you, less if you're fighting upstream. The work of rowing is monotonous and exhausting, and the men sing sometimes to keep the rhythm. Old Norse songs that have been partly translated into a pidgin of Norse and Slavic that has developed along the river routes, and that neither a purebred Norseman nor a Slavic tribesman of the interior would fully recognize. Languages mix along trade routes. It is one of the first things that happens. At the major stopping points, Smolensk on the upper Dnieper, Kiev further south, the various smaller fortified trading posts along the way, you pay tolls, trade intelligence about conditions on the route ahead, resupply when possible, and occasionally deal with a local representative of the Rus prince, who is there to collect taxes, settle disputes, and maintain a rough order that makes the trade viable. These local representatives are usually Norse in name and origin, though increasingly Slavic in language and custom. The dangerous stretch is the cataracts, and you feel the anxiety as you approach them days before you actually arrive. Everyone knows someone who's lost cargo or crew at the cataracts. The portage itself takes the better part of 2 days, unloading everything, rigging ropes and rollers, manhandling the boats across the rocky ground, while a group of armed men stands watch on the heights above, scanning the tree line and the horizon for the pechenegs. You have never been attacked at the cataracts, but you know people who have, and the knowledge sits heavy. Below the cataracts, the river opens into something huge and calm, and the anxiety lifts a little. You're approaching the sea. The landscape flattens. The trees thin out and disappear. The sky becomes enormous. At the Dnieper estuary, you pause to repair equipment and reorganize the convoy. You join with other boats that have been making the same journey, because the coastal sail to Constantinople is safer in numbers. Then you head east along the Black Sea coast, the familiar alien smell of salt water strong after months of river. And 3 days later, on a morning that is always somehow more dramatic than you remembered, Constantinople comes into view. The experience of seeing Constantinople for the first time, and even for the 10th time, must have been extraordinary. The walls, the domes, the forest of masts in the harbour, the sheer scale of the place. The Norsemen who arrived there each spring were hardened, experienced travellers who had been navigating difficult waters for months, and they were still struck dumb by Constantinople. We know this because they went home and talked about it. The Norse sagas call it Miklagarda, the great city, and they return to it repeatedly, always with an awe that doesn't quite diminish even with repetition. In Constantinople, you stayed in the assigned quarter, under conditions specified by the treaty. Byzantine officials supervised the trading. You sold your furs through designated brokers, haggled hard, accepted silk and silver and glass and bronze in exchange, and tried to buy as much silk as you could legally carry. There were Byzantine restrictions on how much silk a Rus trader could take north in a single trip, to protect the Byzantine domestic market and maintain the value of the cloth. You drank the Greek wine, which was stronger and more complex than anything you could get at home. You went, if you were curious, to see the Hagia Sophia, and came back quieter than you went. Then you loaded your return cargo, said goodbye to any acquaintances you had made among the Byzantine merchants and officials, and started the long journey north. The return journey was harder than the outward one. You were going upstream for much of it, and the boats were heavy with goods. But there was also something easier about it. The anxiety of the unknown replaced by the anticipation of home. The Norse who established themselves in the East in the 9th century were, in their own minds, Norse. They spoke Norse, worshipped Norse gods, followed Norse social customs, organised themselves along Norse political lines, and felt, presumably, the kinship that people feel with the culture into which they are born. But the process of becoming something else, something new, something that was Norse in origin but Rus in identity, had begun almost from the moment they arrived, and it accelerated steadily through the 10th century. The first and most powerful engine of this transformation was marriage. Norse chieftains who established themselves in the eastern settlements did not import Norse wives in sufficient numbers to maintain a purely Norse population. They married locally, the daughters of Slavic tribal leaders whose cooperation they needed, the daughters of Finnic chiefs whose territories they needed to cross, occasionally the daughters of other Norse settlers. Their children grew up speaking Slavic alongside Norse, surrounded by Slavic customs and material culture, eating Slavic food, hearing Slavic stories. By the third generation, the Norse identity was still real, but it was no longer exclusive. You could be both Norse and Rus, the way a person can be both Irish American and American, the older identity persisting, honoured, mythologized, but no longer determining the totality of who you are. Language followed the same trajectory. Old Norse gradually gave way to Old East Slavic as the working language of the Rus state, pushed out not by conquest, but by demographics. The Slavic-speaking population of the Dnieper Valley vastly outnumbered the Norse-speaking elite, and in day-to-day administration, in commerce, in communication with the local population, Slavic was simply more useful. Norse persisted longest as a language of identity, names, titles, certain ceremonial formulas, but by the mid-10th century it was already giving ground. The last Rus ruler with a fully Norse name was Igor, who died in 945. His son was Sviatoslav, a Slavic name, carried by a man who was genetically largely Norse and culturally a product of both worlds. Sviatoslav is one of the most extraordinary figures in the early history of the Rus, and he appears in the sources with a vividness that suggests he made an impression on everyone who encountered him. Byzantine sources describe him with a kind of fascinated horror, a man of medium, height stocky with a shaved head except for a single long forelock of hair on one side, a hairstyle shared by the steppe peoples of the region, a single gold earring with a ruby and 2 pearls, fierce blue eyes, and a habit of sleeping on the ground wrapped in his horse blanket, with a saddle for a pillow. He ate no cooked food on campaign, only horse meat or game roasted on the coals. He moved with his army at terrifying speed. He reportedly sent warnings to his enemies before attacking, saying simply, "I am coming for you." He burned the Khazar Khaganate. He occupied Bulgaria. He very nearly destroyed the Byzantine province of Thrace. Sviatoslav was, in his character and his way of war, essentially a Norse chieftain operating in a Slavic and steppe context, the hybrid of the first fully Rus generation. He showed no interest in the administrative consolidation of a state, preferring to spend his time on military campaigns. He divided his territories among his sons before one of his campaigns, which led after his death to a fratricidal conflict among them that was as Norse as it was anything else. The fighting sons of a dead chieftain competing for his legacy. One of those sons, Vladimir, would prove to be the most consequential ruler the Rus ever produced. But before we get to Vladimir and the great religious transformation he presided over, we need to understand what the Rus world looked like in the second half of the 10th century, the world that Vladimir inherited and transformed. By the 970s, the Rus state was a going concern. Kyiv was a substantial city, perhaps one of the largest in Europe outside of Constantinople, with a population of several tens of thousands. Its rulers controlled a territory that extended from the Baltic coast to the northern shores of the Black Sea, and their authority, though often contested and imperfectly exercised, was recognized over a wide area. The trade with Byzantium and the Islamic world continued, generating the silver that oiled the political machinery. The Varangian Guard, Norse mercenaries in Byzantine service, was becoming institutionalized, creating a permanent human connection between the Norse world and the Byzantine court. The Rus had also begun to develop their own religious and cultural identity that was neither purely Norse nor purely Slavic. The Old Norse gods, Odin, Thor, Freyr, were worshipped alongside Slavic deities, and a syncretic religious practice had developed that combined elements of both traditions. Vladimir, before his conversion, reportedly erected a series of idols in Kyiv, representing the major deities of the Rus pantheon, a pantheon that included the Norse Perun, identified with Thor, alongside specifically Slavic and steppe-influenced deities. The Rus were building their own religious world, drawing on multiple sources in the way that hybrid cultures always do. The story of how Vladimir, Prince of Kyiv, chose Christianity is one of the most famous narratives in Russian history, and like most famous founding narratives, it blends historical reality with subsequent mythologizing in ways that are both inevitable and instructive. The primary chronicles account of the choosing of religions, in which Vladimir sends envoys to examine the faith of the Muslims, the Jews, the Latin Christians, and the Orthodox Christians, and each group makes its case, is widely recognized as a literary construct rather than a historical record. But it encodes something real about the choices Vladimir faced and the considerations that shaped his decision. According to the chronicle, the envoys sent to observe the Muslim Bulgars on the Volga were unimpressed. There was no joy in Islam, only sadness and a great smell. The German Catholics of the West seemed dour and without beauty. The Khazar Jews, when asked where their homeland was, admitted they had no homeland, and this seemed a bad omen. But when the envoys went to Constantinople and attended the Orthodox liturgy in the Hagia Sophia, they could not tell if they were in heaven or on earth. We only know that God dwells there among men, they reported, and their service is fairer than the ceremonies of other nations. And so Vladimir chose orthodoxy. The story is beautiful and probably largely invented, but it points to what was almost certainly true. The decision to adopt Byzantine Christianity was shaped more by geopolitical calculation than by spiritual experience. Vladimir's Christianization in 988 was preceded and enabled by a military alliance with the Byzantine Empire in which Vladimir provided military assistance to the Emperor Basil II against a military rebellion, and received in return the unprecedented honour of marriage to a Byzantine princess, Anna, sister of the emperor himself. This was an extraordinary diplomatic achievement, since the Byzantines normally refused to give imperial princesses to barbarian princes as a matter of policy. Vladimir's Christianization was the price of the deal, and the deal was worth paying. But having made the calculation and accepted the deal, Vladimir pursued the Christianization of Rus with a genuinely transformative energy. The idols were thrown down. Perun was reportedly flogged and thrown into the Dnieper by men running alongside it on the bank, an act of deliberate ritual humiliation. The entire population of Kyiv was reportedly ordered into the river for a mass baptism. Byzantine priests and missionaries fanned out across the territory, establishing churches, conducting baptisms, beginning the long process of converting a predominantly pagan population to a new faith. The construction program that accompanied the Christianization was massive. Vladimir built the Cathedral of the Tithes, the first stone church in Kyiv, on the site of the old pagan idol grove, an act of deliberate symbolic supersession. His son Yaroslav the Wise, who ruled from 1019 to 1054 and is in many ways the greatest of the Kiev princes, built the Cathedral of St. Sophia, named after Constantinople's great church, which still stands today in what is now the Ukrainian capital, its mosaics and frescoes still glowing with the gold and blue of Byzantine craftsmanship. The physical landscape of Rus was being remade in the image of Byzantium. The religious transformation was also a cultural transformation of the most profound kind. Christianity brought with it literacy, not just the ability to read, but the entire infrastructure of a literate civilization. Schools, monasteries, scriptoria, libraries, legal codes, administrative texts. The Cyrillic alphabet, developed in the previous century by the Byzantine missionaries Cyril and Methodius for the purpose of translating religious texts into Slavic languages, became the writing system of the Rus, the primary chronicle itself, the document that preserves so much of what we know about the early Rus period, was a product of this monastic literary culture, written down by monks in the late 11th and early 12th centuries, drawing on oral tradition, earlier written sources, and the institutional memory of the Church. The relationship with the Norse world was not immediately severed by the Christianization, but it was fundamentally altered. The conversion of Russia to Orthodoxy and of Scandinavia, gradually over the 10th and 11th centuries, to Latin Christianity meant that the two worlds now belonged to different religious and cultural spheres. The shared pagan culture that had connected them, the gods, the burial customs, the cosmology, was gone, replaced on both sides by versions of Christianity that were superficially similar but institutionally and liturgically distinct. Trade continued, and Norse mercenaries continued to serve in the Rus armed forces and in the Byzantine Varangian Guard, but the deep cultural kinship was becoming a memory. One of the most extraordinary institutions produced by the Norse-Byzantine connection was the Varangian Guard, the personal bodyguard of the Byzantine emperor, recruited from Norse and later Anglo-Norse warriors, and serving in Constantinople for nearly 3 centuries from the late 10th century to the sack of the city by the Fourth Crusade in 1204. The Varangian Guard was, in its time, the most elite military unit in the world, and its history is a microcosm of the larger story of how the Norse found their way into the heart of the medieval world's greatest empire. The origins of the Guard lie in the alliance between Vladimir of Kyiv and the Emperor Basil II that we discussed in the context of the Christianization. As part of the agreement, Vladimir sent 6,000 Rus warriors to serve in Basil's army. These warriors helped Basil crush the rebellion of Bardas Phocas at the Battle of Chrysopolis in 989, distinguishing themselves in the fighting and impressing the emperor with their combination of ferocity and discipline. Basil formalised the Norse contingent as a permanent imperial bodyguard, and the institution was established. The Varangians, the word is the Slavic and Greek version of a Norse term Varangian, meaning roughly men of the pledge, or sworn men, were equipped as heavy infantry, armed with the great two-handed axes that became their trademark in Byzantine iconography. They served as the emperor's personal household troops, escorting him everywhere, guarding his bedchamber, standing at the door of the throne room during audiences. In battle, they were the shock troops held in reserve for the critical moment, the sledgehammer deployed when the tactical situation demanded a decisive blow. The pay was extraordinary by the standards of the age. A Varangian guardsman received a salary significantly higher than a regular Byzantine soldier, plus a share of the gifts and plunder accumulated during campaigns, and the right, carefully regulated but real, to help themselves to money from the imperial treasury after the death of an emperor, in a custom called the palace pillaging. The physical proof of this wealth survives in Scandinavia, where the Byzantine silver and silk and bronze that Varangian veterans brought home can be found in graves and hoards across the Norse world. The Guard's membership was initially predominantly Rus Norse, the same population that had been trading with and raiding Constantinople for a century before the Guard was formalised. But after the Norman conquest of England in 1066, a new wave of recruits arrived. Anglo-Saxon nobles and warriors who had lost their lands and their status in England, and who sought their fortunes in the service of the Byzantine emperor. Some of these men had Viking ancestry themselves. The Norse had settled thickly in the north of England, and the Norse influenced Danelaw, but they were culturally Anglo-Saxon, and they brought their own customs, their own language, and their own grievances with them. Harold Hardrada, Harold the Hard Ruler, is perhaps the most famous individual Varangian, and his story is worth telling in some detail because it illuminates so much of the larger narrative. Harold was a Norwegian prince who had fled Norway after the Battle of Stiklestad in 1030, where his half-brother Olaf, later Saint Olaf, patron saint of Norway, was killed. The 15-year-old Harold escaped east to the Rus court of Yaroslav the Wise in Kyiv, where he was sheltered and eventually recruited into a Norse contingent heading for Byzantine service. In Constantinople, Harold served in the Varangian Guard for about a decade, rising through the ranks, campaigning in Sicily against the Normans, in Bulgaria against the Pechenegs, in the Holy Land, in North Africa. Byzantine sources describe him as brave, resourceful and ambitious enough eventually to fall afoul of the Empress, Zoe, who had him arrested on charges that may have included misappropriating war booty that should have been shared with the imperial treasury. He escaped, left Constantinople, returned to Kyiv where he had kept a relationship with Yaroslav the Wise's family. He eventually married Yaroslav's daughter Elizabeth, and from there returned to Norway, where he seized the throne and ruled as one of the most formidable Norse warlords of the 11th century. In 1066, Harold Hardrada invaded England with a large Norse fleet, claiming the English throne. He was killed at the Battle of Stamford Bridge by the English King Harold Godwinson, who then had to rush his army south to face the Norman invasion that had just landed on the Sussex coast. Harold Godwinson was killed at Hastings 3 weeks later. The confluence of events is one of the great historical ironies. A man who had served as an elite Byzantine guardsman in Constantinople died in Yorkshire, setting in motion a chain of events that would bring Anglo-Saxon refugees to Constantinople to serve as his successors in the very institution he had left a decade earlier. The Varangian Guard persisted through the decline of Byzantine power in the 11th and 12th centuries, its composition changing as the source population shifted from Norse to Anglo-Norse to a broader mixture. By the time of the Fourth Crusade in 1204, when a Venetian-led crusading army sacked Constantinople in one of the great atrocities of medieval history, the Guard was still fighting, the last men in their distinctive Norse-influenced armour, the last echoes of the longship crews who had first appeared on the Bosphorus 3.5 centuries earlier. If you wanted to find the Viking presence in Russia through the literary sources alone, you would have only a partial and sometimes frustratingly vague picture. The chronicles were written by monks, working from memory and earlier texts, sometimes centuries after the events they described, filtered through the concerns and assumptions of Christian Slavic culture. The Arab and Byzantine sources are richer in some ways, more immediate, more detailed, more willing to discuss the Rus as a distinct and observable phenomenon. But they too are partial, shaped by the concerns of outsiders observing an unfamiliar culture from a position of either superiority or wariness. Archaeology tells a different story, and in some ways a more honest one. The ground preserves what the written record omits or distorts, and the ground of Eastern Europe has been yielding Viking-era material in increasing quantities since systematic excavation began in the 19th century. What the excavations reveal is a picture of Norse presence that is at once broader, more deeply integrated into the fabric of the Eastern world, and more complex than the literary sources suggest. The burial record is perhaps the most evocative, along the great river routes, particularly at the major trading centres. Staraya Ladoga, Gnezdovo near Smolensk, Shestovica near Chernigov, the various burial mounds around Kyiv and Novgorod. Archaeologists have found graves that are unmistakably Norse in character. Boat burials, where the deceased was laid in a wooden boat surrounded by grave goods. Chamber graves, where the burial pit was lined with wood to create a room, furnished with the objects the dead person would need in the afterlife. Cremation burials of the type described by Ibn Fadlan. The ashes and burned grave goods interred in a pit or covered by a mound. The grave goods from these burials constitute a material archive of extraordinary richness. Norse tortoise brooches, the characteristic paired brooches worn by Norse women on their overdresses, shaped like stylized tortoises and recognizable from Scandinavia to Russia, appear in graves along the Volga and the Dnieper. Norse-style weapons, swords of the type produced in Frankish and Norse workshops, with characteristic pommel, shapes and blade decorations, Norse jewellery, amber beads from the Baltic, silver rings twisted in the spiral pattern favoured by Norse craftsmen, pendants in the shape of Thor's hammer. But the graves also contained something else, evidence of the hybridization that was occurring from the earliest period of Norse settlement. In many graves, Norse objects are found alongside Slavic pottery, alongside steppe-style ornaments, alongside items that came from the Islamic world or from Byzantium. The dead were people who had lived in multiple cultural worlds simultaneously, and their burials reflect that complexity. A woman buried with Norse tortoise brooches might also have Slavic-style ear pendants and a Byzantine cross. A warrior buried with a Norse sword might be accompanied by a steppe-style quiver and Khazar-style horse harness. One of the most remarkable sites in this regard is Gnezdovo, on the upper Dnieper near Smolensk, which was excavated beginning in the 19th century and continues to yield material today. Gnezdovo was a major trading and artisan centre on the eastern river route, and its burial ground, which contains over 3,000 mounds, the largest concentration of Viking-era burial mounds outside of Scandinavia itself, reflects the multicultural character of the settlement with startling clarity. Norse, Slavic, and Finnic burial traditions are all present, sometimes in adjacent mounds, sometimes combined in a single grave. The silver hoards are another major category of archaeological evidence, and they tell a story of wealth that is staggering even by modern standards. Hoards of Arabic dirhams have been found throughout the region, reflecting the trade with the Islamic world. But the most dramatic finds are the composite hoards, collections of coins and silver objects from multiple sources, buried presumably for safekeeping during some period of instability and never recovered by their owners. These hoards contained dirhams from the Islamic world, Byzantine silver millioresia, Carolingian and Anglo-Saxon coins from the West, and masses of hack silver objects that had been cut up to use as bullion, their original form irrelevant once they were to be weighed rather than counted. The hack silver is particularly telling. It reflects an economy in which the silver content of metal was more important than its form, a weight-based rather than coin-based monetary system, characteristic of the Norse world and of the trading networks they operated in. You could pay for goods with a portion of a Byzantine bracelet just as easily as with a dirham, as long as you had a scales to weigh it. Norse merchants carried small, portable balance scales with them. Archaeologists find them regularly in Viking-era grave contexts, including along the eastern routes, and the ability to weigh silver quickly and accurately was a basic commercial skill. The runestones of Scandinavia provide yet another layer of evidence. More than 30 runestones found in Sweden, most of them in the regions of Uppland, Södermanland and Östergötland, which were major sources of Eastern traders and warriors, explicitly commemorate men who died in the east, in Gardarki, the Norse name for the Rus lands, or on specific rivers and routes. He died in Holmgard, the Norse name for Novgorod. He fell at the Dnieper cataracts. He went east for gold. These are the voices of families back home, marking the loss of men who never came back from the river routes, and they tell us that the Eastern expedition was common enough to need no further explanation. Everyone knew what he went east meant. One runestone found at Ed in Uppland commemorates a man named Ragnvald, who had led the Varangian Guard in Constantinople, a private memorial to a career that touched the highest levels of Byzantine imperial service. Another, from Gripsholm in Södermanland, commemorates two brothers who went east for gold and died, in the south, in Sörkland, the Arabic world. The stone's inscription ends with a simple, devastating line. They went bravely. Far away they gave food to the eagle. A kenning for dying in battle, the formula as old as Norse poetry, applied to a death in the deserts of Persia or the markets of Volga far, far from the Swedish lake where the stone still stands. By the early 11th century, under the reign of Yaroslav the Wise, the Kievan Rus had become one of the most sophisticated states in Europe. Its capital, Kyiv, was a city of remarkable cultural and architectural achievement, its churches and monasteries rivaling anything in the Western Christian world. Its legal code, the Russkaya Pravda, the Russian Truth, was one of the earliest written law codes in Eastern Europe, drawing on both Norse and Byzantine legal traditions to create a system that was genuinely appropriate to the society it governed. Its royal family was connected by marriage to virtually every major ruling house in Europe. Yaroslav's sons married into the Swedish, Byzantine, Polish, and German dynasties. His daughters became queens of France, Hungary, and Norway. The Norse identity of this royal family was still present, but becoming historical rather than lived. Yaroslav himself bore a Slavic name, spoke Old Slavic, governed through Slavic administrative structures, and practiced Orthodox Christianity with every appearance of genuine devotion. But he was also the son of Vladimir, grandson of Sviatoslav, great-grandson of Igor, great-great-grandson of Rurik, a Norse name at the top of every genealogical tree. He maintained the Varangian connection, employing Norse mercenaries, corresponding with Norse rulers, standing as godfather to Harald Hardrada in the most literal sense of the word, by protecting and employing him at his court. The trading network that had made the Rus state possible continued to function, though the balance was shifting. The Volga route to the Islamic world was disrupted in the mid-10th century, when Sviatoslav destroyed the Khazar-Khaganate, eliminating the most important intermediary in the route, with the consequence that direct Rus trade with the Islamic world became more difficult, and the flow of dirhams north began to slow. The Dnieper route to Byzantium remained important, but it too faced increasing difficulty from the steppe nomads, the Pechenegs, and later the Cumans, who controlled the grasslands through which the lower Dnieper passed, and who periodically disrupted or taxed the trade convoys. The fragmentation of the Rus state after Yaroslav's death in 1054 is one of the great tragedies of Eastern European history, and it was a fragmentation that had deep structural roots. The Rurik dynasty, following the inheritance customs of its Norse origins, divided the realm among all the deceased rulers' sons, each of whom governed a principality and competed with his brothers for precedence and resources. This was not a custom invented by the Norse. It was a common feature of early medieval kingdoms throughout Europe, but it had the same effect everywhere it operated. It turned brothers into rivals, created instability at every succession, and made the kingdom vulnerable to external pressure at the moment when a strong, unified response was most needed. The Mongol invasion of 1237 to 1240, which destroyed Kyiv and most of the other major Rus cities, and reduced the Rus principalities to subordinate states paying tribute to the Golden Horde, came at a moment when the political fragmentation of the Rus world was at its most extreme, and its military capacity at its most divided. The Vikings who had founded the Rus state had built something that endured for nearly 4 centuries. They had not built something that could withstand the storm that came out of the east in the 13th century. Almost nothing could. But the end of Kievan Rus was not the end of the story. The cultural and religious inheritance that the Rurik dynasty and the Byzantine Church had built survived the Mongol catastrophe, preserved in the monasteries and the books and the churches, kept alive in the memories of communities that had been devastated but not destroyed. From the wreckage of the Mongol conquest, new political forms gradually emerged, the Principality of Moscow above, all which over the following centuries would grow to absorb the other surviving Rus territories and eventually become the core of the Russian Empire. The Muscovite princes claimed descent from Rurik, as every Russian ruler would for 6 centuries. The church they served was the Orthodox Church that Byzantium had given to Vladimir in 988. The writing system they used was the Cyrillic alphabet developed by Byzantine missionaries. The culture they inhabited was a unique blend of Norse, Slavic, Byzantine, and steppe elements that had been developing along the rivers of Eastern Europe for 200 years before the Mongols arrived. The Norse contribution to this inheritance is real, significant, and ultimately irreducible, even if it has been debated, minimized, and politically manipulated at various points in the subsequent history. You cannot understand Russia or Ukraine without understanding the rivers, and you cannot understand the rivers without understanding the Norse who first navigated them at continental scale. The frozen Silk Road was not just a trade route, it was a cultural axis around which a new civilization formed. History rarely ends cleanly. The story of the Viking Longships on the rivers of Eastern Europe did not conclude with a single dramatic event. It dissolved gradually into the fabric of the cultures it had helped to create, leaving traces that are still visible if you know where to look. In the languages of Eastern Europe, Norse words survive as linguistic fossils, preserved by their adoption into Slavic and Finnic languages at the period of maximum Norse influence. The Russian word for a large iron kettle, kotel, may derive from Norse. The word yabida, meaning an informer or talebearer, possibly derives from Norse embeti, meaning office or official position. More significantly, the names of some Russian rivers and places preserve Norse etymology, though this is a field where scholarly caution is essential since it is easy to over-identify Norse origins in place names that may have independent Finnic or Slavic sources. In Ukraine, the legacy of the Rus period is deeply intertwined with the country's sense of its own origins. Kyiv, the mother of Rus cities, the place where Oleg hung his shield on the gates, and where Vladimir threw the idols into the Dnieper, is the capital of the modern Ukrainian state, and the period of Kievan Rus is claimed as a foundational moment in Ukrainian national history. The Cathedral of St. Sophia, built by Yaroslav the Wise in the first half of the 11th century, is a UNESCO World Heritage Site and one of the most visited historic buildings in Eastern Europe. Its mosaics, preserved largely intact through centuries of changing rulers and changing religions, are the most vivid surviving physical testimony to what the Norse-founded Rus state became at its most culturally ambitious. The rune stones in Sweden that commemorate the men who went east are still, standing most of them, in the landscapes where they were raised 1,000 years ago. The great stone at Gripsholm with its lament for the brothers who died in Sörkland stands at the edge of Lake Mälaren, within sight of the water that these men would have sailed on their way east. If you stand at that stone on a grey autumn morning, with the lake still and the birches beginning to turn, and you read the inscription, you can feel the connection between that particular moment of grief, a family by a Swedish lake commissioning a stone for their dead, and the vast, complicated story of which it was a part. The Dnieper River still flows south through Ukraine, though the cataracts that terrified the Rus convoys are now submerged beneath the reservoir created by the Dnieper hydroelectric dam, built in the 1930s under Stalin. The portage towns of the Upper Volga still carry their old names. Novgorod is still Novgorod, though it now adds the qualifier Veliki, great, to distinguish itself from the other Novgorods that multiplied across Russia in subsequent centuries. Staraya Ladoga, Old Ladoga, the probable beginning of the entire Eastern Norse story, is a small town on the Volkhov River in the Leningrad Oblast of Russia, with a Kremlin and a small museum, and the Volkhov still runs dark and quiet past its walls. The genetic evidence, which has become increasingly sophisticated in recent decades, as ancient DNA analysis has been applied to early medieval burials, adds another dimension to the story. Studies of graves from Nestevo and other Eastern Rus sites have found clear Scandinavian genetic signatures in some individuals, consistent with the historical and archaeological evidence for Norse settlement. But these same studies show the rapid genetic mixing that occurred from the earliest period, Norse settlers intermarrying with Slavic and Finnic populations, producing within a generation or two individuals who were genetically as much one as the other. The mixing was not just genetic. Every time a Norse trader stayed over winter in a Slavic town and learned enough of the local language to bargain effectively, every time a Slavic woman married into a Norse household and brought her cooking, her craft traditions and her stories with her, every time a Rus prince who was half Norse by blood made a political decision using the administrative vocabulary and institutional framework of a Slavic kingdom, the cultures were merging. This is how civilizations are actually made, not in dramatic founding moments, but in the accumulated small decisions and encounters of ordinary life, adding up over generations to something that is genuinely new. The Rus were something genuinely new. They were not Norse transplanted to the Dnieper. They were not Slavs with Norse masters. They were something that had emerged from the encounter between the two worlds, shaped by the rivers that connected them and the trade that flowed along those rivers, and the violence and the commerce and the intermarriage, and the slow, patient work of cultural negotiation that constitutes the actual substance of medieval life. They built cities and legal codes and churches. They produced saints and warriors and merchants and scholars. They launched ships that reached from the Arctic Circle to the Caspian Sea, and they did it on rivers that froze every winter and thawed every spring, and ran always, inexorably, toward the sea. The Viking Age in the East ended more quietly than it began. There was no single battle, no dramatic moment of defeat, no clear line that can be drawn between the Viking period and what came after. Instead, the Norse identity in the East simply dissolved, absorbed into the cultures it had encountered and helped to shape. the way salt dissolves in water, invisibly, completely, but leaving the water changed. By the mid-11th century, the flow of new Norse settlers into the eastern river routes had slowed to a trickle. The great trading networks that had drawn Norse entrepreneurs eastward were still operating, but they were now operated by people who identified as Rus rather than Norse, who spoke Slavic, who worshipped in Orthodox churches, who wrote their administrative documents in Cyrillic. The Varangian Guard in Constantinople continued to recruit from Scandinavia and Britain, but it was an institution, a career option, a known quantity, no longer the frontier adventure that had drawn the first generation of Norse warriors east. In Scandinavia itself, the social conditions that had produced the Viking expansion were changing. The consolidation of royal power in Norway, Denmark and Sweden meant that the independent, ship-owning chieftains who had been the driving force of Norse expansion faced increasing competition from organised states that wanted to direct and tax trade rather than leave it to freebooting entrepreneurs. The conversion of Scandinavia to Christianity, which was largely complete, by the mid-11th century removed the cultural framework, the warrior religion, the cremation burials, the hall culture, the gods who rewarded boldness and punished timidity, that had supported the Viking ethos. The last great Norse adventure in the East was, in a sense, the First Crusade in 1096, which drew Varangian Guard veterans and their families into the Crusader armies, and which connected the Norse-Byzantine world to the new project of Latin Christianity in the Holy Land. But this too was a dissolution rather than a continuation. The men who went on the crusade were not going east on their own terms, following their own routes, answering to their own gods. They were going as Christian soldiers, under the discipline of the Church, in the service of a project that was fundamentally different from anything the Viking Age had produced. The rivers, of course, did not change. The Volkhov still ran from Lake Ilmen to Lake Ladoga. The Dnieper still ran south from the forest to the steppe. The Volga still ran east and south to the Caspian. They froze every winter and thawed every spring. They carried their dark water through landscapes that had been shaped by human activity for centuries and would continue to be shaped by it for centuries more. The portage routes were still used, the trading posts still functioning, the cities still growing. But the people who used them were different now, more settled, more agricultural, more Christian, more Slavic. The longships were gone, replaced by broader, heavier riverboats adapted to trade rather than to war. The men with braided beards and iron rings on their arms, speaking a language that sounded like nothing the locals had heard before, had become the locals. In the monasteries of Kyiv and Novgorod, monks were writing down the history of what had happened, imperfectly, with the biases of their time and their faith, but also with a genuine awareness that they were recording something important. The primary chronicle opens with a sense of purpose that is still moving to read. These are the tales of bygone years, regarding the origin of the land of Rus, who first began to rule in Kyiv, and from what source the land of Rus had its beginning. The monks who wrote those words were trying to understand their own origins, to trace the thread back to the beginning, to the invitation of the Varangians, to the longships on the rivers, to the frozen silk roads of the north. They understood, in their own way, that what had happened along the rivers of Eastern Europe in the 9th and 10th centuries was genuinely extraordinary. They may not have had access to the full historical record. They were certainly working with a mythology as much as a history, but they knew that the world they inhabited, the world of Orthodox Christianity, of the Rus state, of the river cities, and the trade networks and the complex culture that had developed along the Dnieper and the Volga, had come into existence through a series of encounters and transformations that were worth remembering. And they were right. The spiritual life of the Norse who came east was, like everything else about them, a complex and adaptive thing, shaped by encounter and negotiation rather than fixed by doctrine. The Norse religious world was polytheistic, mythologically rich, and fundamentally pragmatic in its orientation. You worshipped the gods not because they demanded it as a matter of cosmic principle, but because they could help you, and because failing to honour them was unwise. The gods were powerful beings with whom you maintained a working relationship, not omniscient creators who required your submission. Odin, the Allfather, the god of wisdom and war and poetry, occupied a special place in the consciousness of the Norse warrior class. He was a god of cunning as much as strength, a deity who gained wisdom by sacrificing his eye and hanging himself on the world tree Yggdrasil, a god who valued knowledge so much he was willing to suffer for it, which made him an appropriate patron for the kind of long-distance trading and raiding that required both physical courage and commercial intelligence. The Viking traders on the eastern routes were, in a real sense, Odin's men, people who had given up the safety of home for the uncertain rewards of the horizon. Thor, the thunder god, was probably more widely worshipped among the ordinary people. Farmers, sailors, craftsmen who needed protection and a steady hand rather than Odin's dangerous capricious wisdom. Thor's hammer, Mjolnir, was the most common religious symbol in the Norse world, worn as an amulet by warriors and civilians alike, found in graves from Scandinavia to the Volga. The hammer pendants discovered in Eastern Rus burials tell us that the people buried there had not abandoned the religious practices of their homeland, whatever accommodations they may have made to the local religious environment. The practice of religion on the river routes was necessarily portable. There were no temples to visit along the Volga, no priest to consult. The religious life of the Norse traders was carried with them, in the small wooden idols they set up at trading posts, in the rune stones they inscribed with dedications to the gods, in the rituals they performed before and after voyages, in the burial customs they maintained even in foreign soil. Ibn Fadlan's account of the Rus religious practices on the Volga describes this portable religious culture with ethnographic precision. The wooden idols in the marketplace, the offerings of food and drink, the prayers for good trading, the animal sacrifices at moments of particular importance. The encounter with Christianity and Islam along the eastern routes inevitably affected the religious consciousness of the Norse traders and settlers. In Constantinople, they encountered a Christianity of extraordinary sophistication and sensory power. The liturgy in the Hagia Sophia, with its clouds of incense, its choral music, its mosaics shimmering in candlelight, was specifically designed to overwhelm the senses and produce an experience of divine presence. Norse warriors who had grown up in a religious tradition centered on outdoor sacrifices and the telling of mythological stories found the Byzantine liturgical experience genuinely powerful. Individual conversions began early, long before the official Christianization of Rus under Vladimir. The encounter with Islam along the Volga route was different in character. The Arab traders and diplomats whom the Rus met in Bulgar and along the Caspian coast practiced a religion that was, in some ways, even more demanding than Christianity. Its prohibition of alcohol was particularly at odds with the Norse cultural world, in which the sharing of drink was a fundamental social bond. Ibn Fadlan's careful notation of the Rus drinking habits reflects the Islamic perspective on this. He observed but did not condemn, maintaining the stance of a trained diplomat in a foreign environment. The Rus traders, for their part, seem to have had no interest in Islam as a personal religious option. The silver the Islamic world offered was desirable. The abstinence from drink and pork that its religion required was not a price anyone was willing to pay. The religious syncretism that developed in the Rus settlements along the rivers was genuine and organic rather than forced. People who lived their lives at the intersection of multiple religious worlds naturally incorporated elements of each into their practice, not out of confusion or shallow commitment, but out of the practical wisdom of people who understand that different situations call for different resources. A Norse trader in Constantinople might pray at an Orthodox church before a business negotiation, calculating that the local spiritual powers were likely to be more effective on their home ground. The same trader, back in Rus territory, would maintain the traditional Norse ritual practices that connected him to his community and his ancestors, and among the Islamic merchants of Volga, he would observe the courtesies of their religious world without participating, maintaining the careful neutrality that good commercial relationships required. This religious fluidity, which can look like inconsistency from the perspective of any of the traditions involved, was in fact a sophisticated adaptation to a world of diversity. The Norse were not unusual in practicing it. It was the normal behaviour of traders and travellers in the pre-modern world, where maintaining relationships across religious difference was a practical necessity. What makes the Rus case particularly interesting is the way this religious fluidity eventually resolved, not through the triumph of any indigenous Norse religious tradition, but through the adoption of Byzantine Christianity as the official religion of the Rus state, bringing with it the full weight of Byzantine institutional culture and permanently orienting the Rus world toward the south and east rather than the north and west. The Norse gods did not disappear instantly when Vladimir ordered the idols thrown into the Dnieper. They retreated, as suppressed religious traditions tend to do, into the folk culture, into the seasonal festivals, the household rituals, the stories told to children. The feast days of the old religious calendar were gradually overlaid with Christian celebrations, but the underlying patterns often remained. The Norse and Slavic fertility spirits became house spirits and forest spirits. The thunder god's hammer became, in some folk traditions, an object with protective power whose Christian identity was somewhat ambiguous. The world tree became, in a different register, the tree of life of Christian iconography. Transformation is rarely as clean as the official record suggests. The burial practices tell the same story of gradual transformation. In the early period of Norse settlement in the east, burials followed Norse traditions closely: cremation in ship burials, the burning of grave goods, the inclusion of weapons and personal ornaments, and sometimes sacrificed animals or human companions. Over the course of the 10th century, inhumation, burial without burning, became increasingly common, reflecting both Byzantine Christian influence and the local Slavic tradition. By the time of Vladimir's formal Christianization, the Old Norse burial practices had largely given way to Christian forms, though the rich grave goods continued for a generation or two, as if the dead were being equipped for both the afterlife promised by Christianity and the one promised by the older tradition. One of the most poignant examples of this transition is the burial mounds of the Rus princes at Kyiv, the Chernaya Mogila and its companions, great earthen mounds visible from a distance, which the primary chronicle associates with the burial of major Norse-descended rulers of the Rus. These mounds were raised over cremation burials of extraordinary richness. Weapons, silver vessels, gaming pieces, sacrificed horses, the remnants of magnificent funerary feasts. They are, in every detail, Norse burials of the highest status, and they sit in the centre of what would become one of the great cities of Orthodox Christianity. The old religion and the new city occupy the same ground, as they so often do. No history of the Viking presence in the East can be complete without an honest reckoning with the economics that drove it, and those economics were not pretty in all their aspects. The trade that connected Scandinavia to Byzantium and the Islamic world was powered at its base by three commodities: furs, wax and honey, and human beings. The first two were the products of the forest economy of northern and eastern Europe. The third was the product of war. The slave trade was, by volume and value, one of the most important elements of the Eastern commercial system, and the Rus were among its principal organisers. The demand for slaves in the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world was essentially unlimited. Slaves served as domestic servants, agricultural labourers, soldiers, concubines, and administrative personnel throughout both civilizations, and the supply from internal sources was never sufficient to meet the demand. The river routes of Eastern Europe, with their access to the vast Slavic and Finnic populations of the north, provided a reliable source. The mechanisms of enslavement along the eastern routes were various. Some slaves were prisoners taken in the small wars that constantly roiled the frontier zones between the Slavic tribal confederacies, between the nomadic peoples of the steppe and the settled peoples of the forest, between the Rus themselves and their neighbours. A chief who needed silver to pay his warriors might sell prisoners from a recent raid to a passing Rus trader, in a transaction that both parties understood perfectly well as commercial rather than personal. Slaves came through the tribute system, communities that could not pay their tribute in furs or honey might pay in people, a practice that the Rus princes seemed to have accepted without much moral discomfort. The word Slav, becoming the root of the word slave, in most European languages is not a coincidence. It reflects the demographic reality that the primary source of enslaved people for the medieval Mediterranean world was the Slavic-speaking population of Eastern Europe, channeled through the trade networks of the Rus and earlier commercial operators along the same routes. This linguistic fact is a monument to human suffering on a scale that is hard to fully comprehend. Millions of individual lives, disrupted and destroyed, leaving their mark only in the etymology of a word. The furs trade was, by contrast, a story of environmental exploitation rather than human exploitation, though the two are not entirely separate, since the indigenous Finnic and Siberian peoples who trapped the furs were often doing so under conditions of tribute and coercion, imposed by the Rus and their successors. The furs of the boreal forest, the beaver of the river margins, the sable of the deep forest, the mink and otter and fox and squirrel, were luxury goods of the highest order in the medieval world, and the demand for them was insatiable. Byzantine and Islamic elites wore fur as a marker of status. The Orthodox Church used it in vestments and furnishings. The cold winters of Europe and the Islamic world created a practical demand that overlapped with the luxurious. The forest of northern Russia and Siberia was, in effect, a giant warehouse of portable wealth, and the Rus had the access and the logistics to monetize it. The scale of the fur trade's impact on the natural environment is legible in the archaeological and historical record. The beaver, whose fur was among the most highly prized, whose castor glands produced a medicinal substance, castoreum, valued, throughout the medieval pharmacopoeia, was systematically hunted out of the river systems of central and western Russia over the course of the Viking Age and the centuries that followed. Species that had been common in the Dnieper and Volga watersheds when the Norse first arrived had become rare or absent by the 13th century, pushed eastward as the commercial pressure on each new source drove trappers further and further into the Siberian interior in search of fresh populations. The fur trade was the original engine of Russia's eastward expansion, the drive that would eventually carry the Russian frontier across Siberia to the Pacific and beyond. The honey and wax trade was more sustainable in ecological terms, but no less important commercially. The beekeeping traditions of the Slavic peoples of the Dnieper and Volga regions were ancient and sophisticated, and the productivity of the forest edge environments where domestic bees thrived was extraordinary. Honey was exported, in barrels, the same barrels that served as the original unit of the tribute system, which specified tribute in terms of pots or pelts of honey. Wax was even more valuable per unit weight. The candles burned in Orthodox churches, in Byzantine palaces, in Islamic mosques throughout the medieval world represented an enormous ongoing demand, and the wax of the Rus hinterland was among the highest quality available. When you light a candle in a medieval church, you are participating, very indirectly, in the same commercial system that brought the longships to the Volkhov. The commercial sophistication of the Rus traders should not be underestimated. These were not simple raiders bringing loot to market. They were experienced commercial operators who understood credit, who worked with agents, who formed partnerships that extended across the entire length of the trading network. The treaty clauses that specified how Rus traders in Constantinople were to be treated in legal disputes, how debts were to be collected, how theft was to be punished, how shipwrecked cargo was to be handled, reflect a commercial culture that had developed detailed norms and expectations around long-distance trade. The Rus were, in the fullest sense, merchants as well as warriors, and the two identities were not as separate as popular imagination tends to suggest. The wealth generated by this commercial system was enormous and transformative. The silver hoards of Scandinavia represent only the portion of the Eastern trade's profits that ended up buried. The working capital that was continuously recycled back into new ventures, the payments for ships and crews and goods, the tribute paid to Rus princes, the fees charged at portages and markets, all of this was moving continuously through the system, generating economic activity at every level. The construction of Kyiv's great churches in the 11th century, the payment of the Varangian Guard in Constantinople, the building of the great trading emporiums at Hedeby and Birka in Scandinavia, all of these were downstream effects of the commercial system that the Norse had pioneered on the eastern rivers. The system was fragile as well as productive, dependent on the maintenance of political stability along the entire length of the route. When the Khazar Khaganate collapsed in the mid-10th century, disrupting the Volga route, the commercial consequences were significant. When the steppe nomads became more aggressive in the 11th century, the Dnieper route became more expensive and dangerous to maintain. The Rus princes spent enormous resources and political capital trying to keep the rivers open, building fortifications at key points, mounting military campaigns against the Pechenegs and later the Cumans, negotiating treaties and paying tolls. The commercial system required a security apparatus, and the security apparatus required the commercial system to fund it. This circular dependency was the structural basis of the Kievan Rus state. The markets where the Rus sold their goods were not just places of commercial transaction, but spaces of cultural encounter, and the cultural consequences of that encounter rippled outward in ways that are still visible. The Norse traders who spent seasons in Constantinople came home with Byzantine ideas about art, architecture, and religion. The Islamic scholars and merchants who observed the Rus in Bulgar and along the Caspian produced texts, Ibn Fadlan's Risala being the most famous, that preserved detailed observations about Norse culture at a moment when that culture was still vital, and before the transformations of the Christianization had remade it. The Slavic craftsmen who worked alongside Norse metalworkers in the mixed settlements of the river routes absorbed Norse design elements and techniques, producing the hybrid artistic style that is one of the distinctive features of early Rus material culture. Commerce was also, always, a form of cultural exchange. Imagine standing at the edge of the Volkhov River on a February morning in the year 900. The sky is white with cloud, and the light is the particular flat, even shadowless light of a northern winter, which makes everything look slightly unreal, slightly too bright, as if the world is illuminated from within rather than from above. The river in front of you is frozen solid, its surface a field of grey-white ice that extends to the wooded banks on the far side and disappears around the bend in both directions. On the bank near you, there are ships. They are pulled up out of the water, or rather, they were pulled up in the autumn before the ice came, and they have been here for months now, shrouded in snow waiting. They are longships, or something close to it, clinker-built, shallow-drafted, with a curved prow that is the signature of Norse shipbuilding. They are not beautiful in the way that museums have taught us to think of Viking ships. They are working boats, and they show it. The planks are stained with water and river sediment. There are patches where repairs have been made. The oar holes are worn smooth. These ships have been used hard, and they will be used hard again. Around the ships, men are preparing for the spring. They're checking the caulking between the planks, replacing any that has dried out and cracked over the winter. They're oiling the rowlocks and the steering oar fittings. They are loading cargo, bales of fur, barrels of honey, packages of wax. They are talking, laughing occasionally, arguing about the load distribution, about the route, about the Pecheneg situation near the cataracts. They are speaking a language that is a mixture of Norse and Slavic, with some Finnic words thrown in when precision demands it, the natural result of years of living and trading at the intersection of three cultures. In a few weeks, the ice will break. The river will run high and fast and brown with snowmelt and the debris of winter. The ships will be launched, loaded, crewed. The convoy will begin its journey south, to Kyiv, to the cataracts, to the Black Sea, to Constantinople. Some of the men on this voyage will not come back. They will die at the cataracts, or in a Pecheneg raid, or of illness somewhere along the lower Dnieper, or in a trading dispute gone wrong in a Constantinople waterfront tavern. Their families will wait for them, and eventually stop waiting, and eventually commission a runestone if they could afford it, with a line about dying far away and giving food to the eagle. The ones who do come back will bring silver and silk and stories. They will be changed by their journey. They always are. They will have spent months among people who were not Norse, eating food they didn't grow up with, sleeping in buildings they didn't build, worshipping in churches that would have been incomprehensible to their grandparents. They will have traded, argued, perhaps fought, perhaps loved. They will have seen the Hagia Sophia, or they will know men who have seen it, and the knowledge will sit in them like a kind of permanent wonder, a reference point for the inadequacy of everything else. And they will have moved their ships along the frozen rivers, carried them over the watershed, navigated them through the cataracts, sailed them across a sea that the Greeks named for its hospitality, and that everyone else named for its storms. They will have traced one more time the route that connected the Arctic forests where the beaver and the sable lived to the Golden City, where the emperor sat on his throne of porphyry, and the patriarch burned incense before icons that were older than memory. They did this for 2 centuries and more. They changed the world in ways that are still visible, in the cities they founded, in the cultural traditions they carried and blended and transmitted, in the dynasty whose descendants would rule Russia for 700 years, in the religious and linguistic inheritance that still shapes the lives of hundreds of millions of people. They did it in wooden boats on frozen rivers, by the light of iron lanterns, in the cold of northern winters and the sudden brief heat of steppe summers, speaking a language that no one speaks anymore in a world that has been utterly transformed since they lived in it. But the rivers are still there. The Volkhov still flows north to Ladoga. The Dnieper still flows south to the sea. The watershed between them is still crossed every day by trucks on roads that follow routes first mapped by men pulling longships through the forest. The frozen Silk Road is still there, beneath the asphalt and the agriculture and the centuries of subsequent history, running through the landscape like a hidden river, carrying the memory of the people who first travelled it in longships, who looked at the frozen rivers of a strange country and saw in their gleaming white surface a road. That is where we end, tonight. On a frozen river, in the silence of a northern winter with the longships waiting on the bank and the spring thaw still weeks away, and the whole great adventure, the rivers and the portages and the cataracts and the silver and the silk and the transformation of a culture and the founding of nations, still ahead of us, shimmering in the distance like the gold of Constantinople reflected in the grey waters of the Bosphorus. Thank you for travelling these rivers with us tonight. Sleep well wherever you are. The waters are quiet, the ice is holding, and the ships are ready.